Joining me now, Alice Gaynor. You were in the court for that dramatic reading of the verdict. What was it like?
So it was dramatic, really, because around 4:15, the judge came into the courtroom. We hadn't received a note from the jury all day, really, so we thought they were going to be dismissed. The judge said as much. He said, I'm going to give them a few more minutes, and then I'm going to dismiss them, release them for the day at 4:30. Well, all of a sudden, he came back in after 4:30, and the jury had a note. Now, normally when there's a note, the buzzer goes off, it rings in the courtroom. We didn't even hear that. So that's why it was so shocking, because the judge said, we've received a note, the jury has reached a verdict, and they would like 30 more minutes to fill out the forms if that's okay. So there was this audible gasp in the courtroom because nobody was expecting it. They thought they were going to be dismissed for the day and that we'd be back tomorrow. So behind me it was a row of the public, and I heard court officers telling them, no outbursts in court, one way or the other, keep it quiet. So when the jury was brought in, the foreperson read the verdict, all 34 counts, guilty. They cut the video feed to the defense table, so we could not see the former president's reaction, because normally we can see the monitor with our binoculars. Even though we're in the main courtroom, we don't have a view of his face because
he's
we're
in front of you.
behind him.
Right.
Exactly. So they cut the feed. We couldn't see his face in that moment. The jury, from what I could see, no expression. And all you could hear in the courtroom at that point was really loud typing. All of the journalists in there, who were nervous, by the way, because the Wi-Fi has been so spotty all day.
They don't want to get it wrong, right?
Exactly. So thankfully it worked out. We were able to update the public. When the former president walked out, he was very red-faced. He sort of awkwardly went to reach for Eric Trump, his son's hand. I don't know if he shook it or what he was trying to do, a father-son moment. And when he was walking out, he was a little bit sweaty, had a very angry expression on his face. He walked outside. We just heard him speak a few moments ago. You had that soundbite. And he said a lot of the things he's been saying this entire trial, that it was rigged. We do know sentencing will be July 11th. And 10 a.m.
4 days before the Republican National Convention, which is extraordinary.
That's right. And the defense, they're the ones who were pushing for a mid-July sentencing date. They spoke up first. And there was a moment the judge said, what's the bail status? And prosecutors said, there is no bail.
There is no bail.
So the former president walked out, he left, and we were immediately released from the courtroom, which, as you know, typically we're frozen in place when he's on the move. But today, they let us out actually fairly quickly.
Now, you've been there for 6 weeks, and you've seen this develop and really end. And a lot of people said, hey, 2 days of deliberations, maybe 10, 12 hours, that was rather quickly for a very complex case. How did you view it when it all unfolded?
Well, again, it was surprising because we thought they were going home, but I actually thought there would be a verdict today. You can never, ever predict what a jury is going to do. But this has been a long trial, and they deliberated yesterday all day. They had a few notes that they sent. They got readback of testimony from Michael Cohen, from David Pecker, namely about that 2015 Trump Tower meeting. That is the meeting between Trump, Cohen, and Pecker, where Pecker volunteered to be the eyes and ears of the Trump campaign. So they reheard that testimony, and they also requested a portion of readback from the judge's instructions. That jury instruction sheet is 55 pages.
Right. Well, that's another reason why we're all sitting there. This is going to take a lot of time, right? And yet it came very quickly. And I also have to ask you, when you just mentioned, did you ever see a turning point within the trial? I mean, you looked at those jurors every day. Were they getting bored? Did they seem engaged all the time? They had a former president sitting in front of them. That is, they felt probably that they had a high bar if they were going to bring back a guilty verdict, correct?
I mean, they were focused this entire trial. You really have to give them credit, and as they should be. And yesterday, I noted in my live report, the judge was thanking the alternate jurors who were not yet dismissed yesterday. They had to stick around. He was saying, I know you're paying attention. I've seen you taking notes. One of you went through 3 notebooks.
Oh,
so they have been paying attention. And I mean, granted, it's a trial, and prosecutors called 20 witnesses. Some of them were people who work for Verizon, for AT&T, and they're custodial witnesses. They're just testifying about phone records. And that can get a little boring in court, but to their credit, again, they were paying attention. I mean, you have the former president as the defendant.
Right, and then Stormy Daniels walks in and it becomes a big show, right?
Right, but, I didn't see, they kept their faces expressionless pretty much. So you really couldn't tell what they were thinking. And today, I do have to mention, I was thinking about it, although I could not see the former president's face in that moment, before, when he walked into the room, he was in a really good mood.
Right.
Again, probably because he thought we were leaving for the day. And actually, another journalist turned to me and said, "Why do you think he's in such a good mood? You know, did new poll numbers come out or something?"
Right.
And then obviously that soured quickly. But when they said they had a verdict, he was sitting there, and I saw him with his eyes closed again. And that's been his demeanor this entire trial. I don't know whether it's by design. He wants to give that
nobody
impression.
said,
We don't know. We've asked him.
Was he sleeping? Was he not?
Right. Other journalists have asked him, and he
Right.
doesn't answer that question. So he was sitting there, no expression, before the verdict was read, seemingly, again, with his eyes closed.
Alice Gaynor, extraordinary. Final thoughts. You got to be back here on July 11th.
July 11th, 10 a.m. for sentencing. That's right. So I know the defense is going to be filing an appeal. They tried to file a motion for acquittal. That was denied right after the verdict was read. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Christina Maurice, back to you in the studio.
Curious, one note here. The jurors, I'm imagining they hustled out of there pretty quickly, or did anybody speak to them? You know, there's been a lot of secrecy in keeping their privacy literally private. What became of them?
You're absolutely right, Maurice. This is an anonymous jury, not anonymous to the party. So the attorneys knew their names. That's how during jury selection, they were able to pull up some social media posts and dismiss certain jurors who had posted negative things about Mr. Trump online. So they've known their names all along. We, the press in there, do not know their names, and we were asked not to give physical descriptions of them when reporting that the jury had been selected. We could not report their places of employment. So what I'm told is they exit every day. They might be taken out by van, but they were not obviously allowed to speak during the trial. When dismissing them today, the judge said it was up to them now. I mean, now they're free to do whatever they might want. But again, we do not have their names. And so if they want to speak, that's going to be up to them because, again, they were anonymous for their protection.
And it was an extraordinary security contingent. I mentioned it a little briefly around here. But every time anything really happened, if Mr. Trump was leaving the building, everybody was shut down. And moments before the verdict was being read, the officer said to me, if you're going anywhere, don't, because this whole place is being locked down. But the NYPD officials here did a very good job, even in the park where people were yelling and screaming, which they've been doing for the last few weeks. That we didn't have any problems, Maurice and Christine.
And if I can point out one distinction, you know, we covered the Harvey Weinstein trial here, and when the verdict was read for that, a rush of court officers came into that courtroom and surrounded him. Today, it was the same amount of court officers that we've seen the entire trial. Because it's been so secure and so safe, you might think maybe some extra will come in now that we know there's a verdict, but it was just the same amount. And again, there was no audible reaction in that courtroom, no outbursts from the defendant, from anybody. It was just a proceeding, you know, like anyone else.
And Maurice and Christine, it's still been very quiet in the last hour or so since the verdict.
Alice, Dick, as we continue here to watch Trump's motorcade traveling up the FDR. Alice, we talked a lot about Trump and his attorneys. We talked about the jurors. I'm curious to know if you were able to see any reaction from the prosecution's team.
Well, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, he did enter the courtroom once we knew there was a verdict. You know, he's only been in the courtroom a couple of times. I believe he was here for openings, and he was here 2 of the days that 2 of his employees took the stand, witness stand. 2 paralegals in his office were acting as custodial witnesses as well. So he was here in the courtroom to support them during their testimony. And again, he entered today. I could not see his face. I know that he's tweeted. I think we're awaiting a press conference he might be holding, but no visible reaction from prosecutors. One thing I did observe in the courtroom today. So this morning, they're doing readback of testimony, and it takes a while. The defense's table almost seemed a little deflated. And other people noticed this as well. The former president was sitting there, eyes closed. A couple of his attorneys were hunched over. Another was just staring straight ahead. And I compare that to the prosecution table. They were following along on the desk, you know, with the testimony, you know, like school children almost, you know, like following along with what the court reporters were, you know, reading back from the testimony. So it was an interesting day in observing body language and the response from both sides.
And speaking of response, I spoke to Arthur Aidala, who is not working for Trump, but he said Trump has asked him to come and work for him. And he said to me that he feels that the Trump team, he's obviously in touch with them, is very much ready for a lot of appeals. Because remember, this case, as I mentioned, me and Alice and I mentioned moments ago, it was very complex. and that's why the jury had to go through a lot. But in all those complexities, Mr. Aidala told me, are possible appeals. And remember, if we have a sentencing on July 11th, appeal could go at least a year in this state, and that means that any kind of sentencing, even after that date, it all gets pushed off. The conviction technically gets pushed off until it goes through the appeal process. So we have a long way to go before anything can happen here, Christina.
Okay, that we do. Dick Brennan and Alice Gaynor, excellent reporting. Alice, you've been in the courtroom throughout the entire trial. Can't thank you enough for outstanding work. We can see more of it at cbsnewyork.com. Thank you guys so much.
Christina and Maurice, the protesters are still shouting in the park around us, but all the real drama, Alice, was inside that courtroom when those counts were read. What was it like, this really extraordinary moment?
That's right. And, it was dramatic just because around 4:14, the judge came in. We hadn't heard from the jury all day, and he said, I'm going to give them a few more minutes, and then I'm going to dismiss them at 4:30. So the note was at 4:20. We didn't hear it until after 4:30. The judge said, I just received a note from the jury. They've reached a verdict. They would like some more time, about 30 minutes, to fill out the forms. Is that okay? There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from journalists and members of the public because we thought jurors were getting dismissed for the day. That's why that moment in particular was dramatic. However, when the verdict itself was read, it was quiet in that courtroom. All you could hear was the furious typing that journalists were doing. Members of the public were sitting behind me. Court officers had already instructed them no outbursts of any kind, and they were quiet. We could not see the former president's reaction because they cut the video feed. What I mean by that is in the front of the courtroom, they have about 4 large monitors. We are sitting behind him, so obviously we cannot see his face. But if we use binoculars and if we look at those monitors, there's a camera facing the defense table, facing the judge, facing the prosecution, not facing the jury because they are anonymous, but we can usually see his expression if you look closely at the monitor and use binoculars. So we could not see in that moment. Before that moment, he was sitting there expressionless, eyes closed. After the verdict was read, as he was exiting the courtroom, I was sitting close to the middle aisle. So I had a shot of him when he was walking out. He went to reach for his son, Eric Trump, who has been in the courtroom a few times, and his face was red. He was sweating, and he looked obviously very angry. He walked out, and then he addressed the cameras in the hallway.
Yeah, moments later he addressed them. We have that. Let's hear from the former president right now.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Alice, you said what the former president looked like as he walked out. What were the jurors doing? Did they look nervous? How were they reacting?
They've kept quite the poker face throughout this entire trial. We really didn't see many facial expressions from them at all. They've been paying attention, and they exited the courtroom. They did not look in his direction. When they enter the courtroom each day, they also don't look at him. They don't look at the prosecution's table either, though. Sometimes there's one gentleman who looks at him and looks at both tables, but today everyone had their heads down, walked right in, which again is not unusual. That's typically what they do. They're an anonymous jury, Dick, so we don't know if we're going to hear from them because we do not know their names. The attorneys knew their names, but we do not. And some of them, I want to point out, 2 were not born here in the United States. One was from Lebanon, one was from Ireland, and they also have various occupations. 2 are attorneys.
2 attorneys, one who said he didn't know much about criminal law.
Civil litigator and a corporate attorney, and they said during selection, I don't know much about criminal law. So it would be interesting to know how that played an effect in the jury deliberation room, whether those lawyers were able to help at all, but perhaps not, because they asked for a readback of some of the instructions this morning from the judge's instructions to the jury.
Now, you had 20 plus witnesses there. Some of them, as you described, sort of mundane people talking about ledgers, but then Stormy Daniels will come in another day. Michael Cohen would come in another day. What was that up and down in that courtroom? And you never really knew what was coming next, right?
I think people were bracing themselves for explosive testimony from Michael Cohen, but that just wasn't the case. He kept the same calm tone and demeanor, even as on cross-examination the defense tried to, catch him in certain moments, even though defense attorney Todd Blanche at one moment raised his voice in a really high pitch and, called him a liar. He never broke from his even tone when he was testifying on the stand. As for Stormy Daniels, when she first got up there, she was talking very quickly and a few times had to be told.
They said she
down.
was a little nervous, they thought she was. Yeah.
And she was going into perhaps a little bit of too much detail. The defense was objecting to certain things surrounding the alleged
very
act
tawdry,
between them.
too much, right?
Right. But for the most part, I wouldn't say there was a moment where there were any, major theatrics or drama in that courtroom. It very much felt like just a proceeding that was happening, if that makes sense.
Quite the opposite from the former president, who many described they thought he was sleeping half the time.
Unless you're standing next to him, we can't say for certain he was sleeping, but we noticed his eyes were closed a lot. And actually, I noticed, now I can't remember, the day's been very long, whether it was today or yesterday, his head slumped over at one point, and I thought to myself, he's got to be sleeping. But I don't know if that's by design. We don't know. We tried asking him, the reporters in the hallway, were you sleeping? Do you have your eyes closed on purpose? We don't know whether that was his way of, kind of protesting what was going on. I don't know how that played with the jury. I mean, the jury we can't see his face because we're behind him, but the jury has a full view of everything.
And this is a former president. They had a tremendous weight on them. They knew the world was literally watching. And then apparently, though, like many jurors in New York, they just did their duty, right?
That's right. And now it's up to the judge for sentencing July 11th
the big
at 10
day.
a.m. But back to the jury for a moment. You may remember jury selection took 4 days. They would bring in a pool of prospective jurors, 96. I think it was a second pool of 96. Dozens were excused because they were asked if they could be fair and impartial. Many said they could not, and so they were excused. There were a few that seemed to be selected, and then they thought about it overnight, came in. They were very stressed. They were very anxious. They said, I can't do this. So these jurors, what's interesting is sometimes in a trial, an alternate will have to come in for one reason or another. There was no need for the alternates in this trial. Every juror was there on time.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
Early.
I mean, they did their job.
And another thing around this courthouse here, you had Harvey Weinstein trial, or a few, at least some appearances here. Menendez also here, and Trump. I mean, it was somewhat of a three-ring circus going on here, and kind of still is tonight.
And that's the same courtroom where where that trial took place. So same exact one, and he had an appearance yesterday, and they had to move him to a different courtroom. And of course, Menendez, as you mentioned, is around the corner at federal court.
All right.
But right now, it's pretty quiet here, we have to say.
Finally, one more big day in July, and you will be there, no doubt.
That's right.
All right. Christina, Maurice, back to you.
Hey, guys, just one more thing for Alice. I mean, you've sat through every last detail of this case, start to finish. You digested every morsel. Did today surprise you in any way, the kind of speed that this came down with?
It did not, Maurice. Again, we can never predict when a verdict is going to come in, what the jury is thinking. But I said to a couple of people, you're talking to other journalists online in the mornings. We have to get here so early before court even opens. And I said, I don't know. I think it's today. And other people thought, no, it's going to be tomorrow. Some other people, some attorneys and a retired judge thought it would be next week. So it was today.
But again,
I mean, no inside knowledge.
You never know what a jury's going to do, as you know, Maurice and Christine.
Exactly. You never know. Okay, guys, thank you. Excellent work and insight there. We'll come back to you soon. Appreciate it.
CBS News reporter Graham Cates was there and has been following this trial since the beginning. Graham, what stood out to you from the district attorney's remarks this afternoon?
Look, he's really struck the same tone from day one with this case. He said this case is about a charge that maybe isn't so glamorous, but is central to New York being the business capital of the world, which is falsifying business records. And he said that his office has a history of pursuing cases like that and pursuing it seriously, and that he never doubted it.
He was in the courtroom as well. Based on what his public demeanor, I wouldn't expect any reaction from him. But just paint the scene for us. Him in the room with the former president who was facing this jury verdict.
As it was being read, as the jury, the foreperson was saying guilty, guilty, guilty. Trump was staring straight ahead, kind of honestly in a position that he's been sitting in through much of the trial, just kind of sitting, looking straight ahead. And when he finally got excused to leave the room, he stood up and really briefly grabbed his son Eric's hand in kind of a tender moment, and then walked out of the room we've been staring at Trump's face for a long time, and this was as deep and sincere of a frown, I think, as we could see. I mean, it was very clear that he was genuinely upset with what happened.
And what about the rest of the courtroom? I mean, this is an extraordinary moment in American history. It's also an extraordinary moment with this particular ex-president who has had a different relationship with accountability than any other president before, and in his private dealings before he came to Washington. And yet this kind of moved through the court, and now it's out. But what else was happening in that interaction between history and basically a simple courtroom that handles all kinds of cases all the time?
The jurors themselves in this, when they came in, you could tell that they were carrying the weight with them. They looked really serious. They didn't or wouldn't make eye contact with Trump as they were walking in. He had, throughout this trial, as they were coming and going, he had stared at them and appeared to be studying them. But in this moment, he didn't look at them at all. And then the whole courtroom, you're about right. It did feel differently than it normally does. The judge's voice wavered just a little bit as he asked them if they had a verdict. He was just saying kind of the standard lines that you say at the end of a trial when you ask the jury, do you have a verdict? But you could sense just kind of a different tone than we were used to with him. And all of Trump's entourage always projects confidence, but when they came in the room initially, it wasn't to hear the verdict. Everyone had been called back in at 4:15 so that the judge could excuse the jury for the day at 4:30. And instead, the judge came in at some point between 4:20 and 4:30 and said, I received a note from the jury that they've reached a verdict, and they just need about half an hour to fill out the verdict sheet. And then all of a sudden, this whole group was sitting there waiting minute after minute after minute for this verdict that they weren't expecting because they thought the day was about to end. The judge was getting ready to excuse them for the day. And the room got really tense. You could still hear, the clattering of keyboards from all the reporters. But there was no conversation. Trump staring straight ahead. Occasionally, someone might whisper to him, but there was none of this kind of projected confidence that we were used to seeing. And it's not like that was on the other side either. I mean, I think everyone was in their own way holding their breath, waiting for this group of 12 New Yorkers to come back and deliver their verdict.
Graham Cates from Lower Manhattan, where he's been covering this case from its beginning. Thank you so much, Graham. For the first time in the 237-year history of the American presidency, one of the 46 men who has served in that office is a convicted felon. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury in Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York City has unanimously found the former president and current likely Republican nominee guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Mr. Trump spoke outside the courthouse following the verdict.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
Before we begin breaking down the verdict, we want to remind viewers how we got here in the first place. Prosecutors allege, and the jury believed, that the former president, his then attorney Michael Cohen, and National Enquirer publisher David Pecker met at Trump Tower in 2015. They claim the three discussed how to conceal negative stories about Trump in order to get him elected. In October 2016, Cohen and an attorney for adult film actress Stormy Daniels negotiated a $130,000 deal to keep her quiet about an alleged sexual encounter with Trump in 2006. Trump, the jury believed, reimbursed Cohen for the payment, claiming it was for legal fees. That was the criminal issue at the center of this case. For more, let's bring in Errol Barnett and Katrina Kaufman outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Errol is CBS News national correspondent, and Katrina is a CBS News campaign reporter and attorney. Katrina, you've been in the courtroom throughout this trial. Tell us what it was like when the verdict was read.
So I was sitting in the courtroom on the end of one of the rows when the verdict was read, watching the jury, watching Trump. He was just looking straight ahead, very stone-faced. His eyes were so squinted, I honestly couldn't even tell if they were open for some of the time. But the foreman read that he was guilty on all counts, and then the judge goes and confirms with each juror that they concur with that verdict. And so Trump looked at those jurors one by one as they affirmed that they were finding him guilty on all 34 counts in this case. And then when it came to leave the room, Trump got up, turned around, and he and his son, Eric, who'd been sitting slightly behind him, had a quick handshake. Eric had also just been sitting there looking at the jury, looking ahead at his father. And when he walked out of the room, he passed right by me with, I think, the deepest frown that I've ever seen on his face, followed by his attorney, Todd Blanche, who just looked equally morose, and his son and the rest of his team trailing behind him.
Katrina, was there any audible response from either the peanut gallery or the prosecutors or anybody?
I didn't hear any audible response. He just really, honestly sat there just looking so morose, looking straight ahead, almost as though he was trying to block out what was going on, but also hearing it at the same time. But there was very little reaction that I could see. I did see Eric. I was watching him as the charges were being read, and the foreman was saying that he was guilty on the counts. He started shaking his head no slightly as he was looking ahead at his dad.
Errol, this is the first conviction of an American president, a president who has created extraordinary swirl everywhere he goes, and who has some durable and diehard supporters. So with that kind of setup, what was the mood like outside? This also just taking place in a city where people like to go about their business even when extraordinary things are happening all right around them.
Yeah, John, that's certainly evident now. What's interesting is when it was clear that there was a verdict, there was a sense, a palpable sense out here of some type of excitement. You have pro-Trump supporters who've been showing up outside the courthouse for many weeks, and also anti-Trump protesters. What we witnessed after we reported that Trump was guilty on all 34 felony counts is that you had a few dozen pro and anti-Trump protesters here in the streets behind us, as well as a healthy mix of just regular New Yorkers who some were gathering to head towards Trump's motorcade before it left the courthouse. So after the verdict was read, after Trump passed Katrina, Trump was inside the courthouse for a good 30 minutes and then was seen assembling on his motorcade before departing the courthouse, and he was welcomed both by pro-Trump supporters who had lined the streets and anti-Trump demonstrators. Some of those anti-Trump demonstrators you might hear behind us who were chanting on each count, guilty and guilty. And we should also note that one aspect that added to the mood both inside and outside the courthouse was just how relatively quickly these 12 jurors decided unanimously that Donald Trump was guilty. Yesterday, it was only roughly 4 hours of deliberation before they sent back a note requesting more guidance from Judge Merchan and more testimony, specifically from David Pecker. This morning started with them getting that guidance from the judge, getting testimony from David Pecker read back to them. And that's significant because Cohen, of course, had credibility issues. The judge had said you should consider him an accomplice, and so you can't convict based on his testimony alone unless it is corroborated by other testimony and other evidence. And that's precisely what the jurors wanted to go back and examine after they got the additional testimony read to them this morning. So they seem to hone in on the Trump Tower meeting of 2015, the nexus of the scheme, and everything David Pecker said about it that lined up with Cohen's testimony before they returned this unanimous verdict. So relatively a fast decision by this 12-person jury who was made now, an historic decision.
And Katrina, we should note we have not, as far as I'm aware, heard anything from the jury, reminding that at least one person who was in the jury was concerned and left before this all started because of safety concerns. So we don't know whether we'll hear from the jury, though the judge, as I understand, has said they can talk. Katrina, you watched this whole thing. Were you surprised by the speed, by the outcome? Just what struck you in terms of the argument that that Errol was making there? And it sounds like the police are doing a little crowd control behind you. What surprised you about this, Katrina?
I mean, I was absolutely surprised by the speed. I guess to set the scene a little bit more for you, we actually had thought that we were done for the day. The judge brought us all into the courtroom, had said that he was going to release the jury at 4:30, and he was just going to step out for a few minutes. And so we were all waiting, thinking that there was going to be a whole other day of deliberation. But when the judge returned, he said he had gotten a note from the jury. They had their verdict, and they just wanted 30 more minutes to fill out the verdict sheet. So I honestly thought that we were probably going to have another day on this, but this jury has clearly taken the case very seriously. They are always extremely attentive. They are taking lots of notes. This was actually to an alternate, but the judge noted that he saw one of them go through 3 different notebooks during this trial. And to what Errol was saying earlier, they wanted a number of pieces of testimony read back, and they also wanted to hear a part of the jury instruction. It was a significant amount of pages, but they referenced one part specifically, and it was about inference, and they wanted to hear about something related to rain that the judge had written. And it essentially said that, you know, if you wake up in the morning and you see that it's wet outside and you see umbrellas, you can deduce that it rained during the night, and that was something they could apply in this case, that if all of the facts surrounding something led to a certain conclusion, that you could deduce that conclusion if it seemed rational and reasonable. And I think given the many pieces that the jury had to tie together in this case, that was very significant that they wanted to hone in on that detail.
And just quickly on that point, Katrina, that is a legal principle that exists in the law. In other words, you're allowed to use your own reason. You don't need to have videotaped evidence of the crime as alleged. If your reason and the facts leads you to a conclusion, that's not some crazy new route in the law. That's something one would be taught in law school.
Absolutely not. Yes, that is inference. It's just, I think the way that he described it was very palpable for them to understand. And obviously the jury instructions are all about telling them how to apply the law to the facts of this very complicated case. It was a very layered legal charge that they had to comprehend and wrap their minds around. But I think being in that room, the prosecution put on an extremely strong case. And we've talked about it before, but watching the progression of the witnesses and the way it came together was honestly almost like watching a puzzle come together very tightly by the end. And I think they did a really good job of weaving together this narrative, of finding so much documentation, all of the text messages, the emails, the audio recordings. That was another actually interesting part of this morning, is the jury requested headphones, and they ended up either giving them both speakers and headphones, and there were some audio materials in this. One of them was the secret recording that Michael Cohen had made of Donald Trump when they seemed to be talking about the Karen McDougal deal. And we don't know exactly why they wanted it, but it did strike me that when Joshua Steinglass for the prosecution gave his closing argument, there was some debate over whether you could actually hear Trump say the word 150 on the tape. And what 150 means is that's the amount that Karen McDougal was paid for her story. And the prosecution said it indicated that he had knowledge of the fact that they were paying her, of the amount. And he said to the jury, you can get this recording. You can have it in the jury room. I encourage you to play it as loud as you want, as many times as you want. And I promise you that you will hear 150 if you do that. And so when they asked for speakers and headphones, I wondered if that might be what they were doing in there.
Right. That's the September 2016 taped meeting about McDougal, which is not Stormy Daniels, but creates this evidence pattern that the former president was quite concerned about this set of issues and set him on the path to what ultimately happened with Daniels. Errol, let me ask you this question. Safety, I mentioned it before. What's the posture around there right now? And what concerns do officials have about either the safety with respect to the jurors or just in response to this verdict?
Well, it was evident that the NYPD, which is used to, conducting high-profile cases and allowing a busy place like New York to keep operating while protecting everyone who is involved, including the media, it was noteworthy that for today and yesterday, they actually cleared the street behind us, which on the right you'll see the courthouse, on the left is where the media, most of the media is assembled. They cleared it of all parked vehicles for today and yesterday, whereas for the past 6 weeks, people could park their cars as they wish. They wouldn't allow people along the street behind us to stop walking. You could walk if you had business in the court or if you needed to get somewhere, but onlookers who would stop and take pictures and take video and just watch would be ushered along. Let's not forget that just a few weeks ago, the public park directly across from the courthouse had an incident where a man set himself on fire and he ended up passing away that following weekend, but the park had remained open to the public as an example of the NYPD's efforts to allow the city to operate as possible and to have the smallest footprint as possible. But also, as I think we mentioned, this group behind us, which has been growing in the past hour or so, some of them did rush down to where Trump's motorcade was about to exit. Then we saw about half a dozen NYPD trucks and SUVs line the street as well as kind of a show of force. So the NYPD, it would seem, has kind of successfully allowed this trial to take place. Plenty of other trials and proceedings are taking place at the same time, despite the fact that we've had a former president with full Secret Service protection in and out of this building each day these past 6 weeks or so.
History takes place and the people walk on. Errol Barnett and Katrina Kaufman outside the courthouse for us. Thank you very much.